Okay, hi everyone. So this is going to be a video lesson about section 2.6, which is credit cards. And I'm recording this from home because we've had a snow day. So this is not my usual setup. So bear with me, but hopefully you can hear the microphone well. And yeah, it's kind of a shorter section anyway. So I think this will work out well. Yeah, let's look at this first page of section 2.6, credit cards. And as you can see, this page is just full already. There's not really much for us to write. But let's take a look at this. So I won't read every word to you, but it does say using a credit card is an example of an installment loan. These loans differ from fixed installment loans in that there's no schedule for paying a fixed amount each period. Credit card loans require users to make a minimum monthly payment, and that depends on the unpaid balance and the interest rate. It does say customers receive what's called itemized billing. It has the unpaid balance on the first day, the total balance owed on the last day of the billing period, and dates, and so on, and the minimum payment required. Let's see. I want to underline this. What we're going to be doing is called the unpaid balance method. So there are different methods for calculating credit card payments, and this is the one that we'll talk about. It does say that we won't cover these other methods, so I'll just kind of highlight these. The average daily balance method and the previous balance method. We're not covering those, but just letting you know that those exist, and you're welcome to look those up if you're curious. Oh, one other thing is that a month where no interest is accruing, this should actually say a grace period. So most of this section is just examples, and we don't have any big new formulas for this section. This is going to sort of use the simple interest formula that we've seen. So let's just get into this. And the first example already has the solution typed up on the next page. But let's just talk through it and see if I want to highlight anything or write on top of it. So our first example has a credit card that calculates interest using the unpaid balance method. That's what we underlined up above. Said we're going to use that. The monthly interest rate is given. Well, let's see. It says it's that rate on the unpaid balance on the first day of the billing period, less the payments and credits. Here are some details. Okay, so we're given a 1 month period. This is how a lot of these problems are sort of structured, is it'll give us all the details for a 1 month period. So on May 1st, the balance was $1,350. A payment was received on May 8th of that amount. Purchases were made throughout the month. They're given here as dollar amounts. And then by the time we get to May 31st, that's the last day of the billing period. Payment is due soon after that. Okay, so this is one of these problems that has multiple parts. We want to find the interest due. And that's not saying to find the interest rate. It's saying find the amount of interest, so dollars and cents. Find the total balance owed, and then we'll get to part 3 when we get to it. Let's just focus on part 1 and 2 right now. All right, so I'll go ahead and change pages here. Next page has the solution, maybe a couple of things that I want to write on top of it. All right, so part 1 of the problem. We know the monthly interest rate is 1.3%, and we have all of those dollar amounts that were given. So here is the simple interest formula that we've seen. So I'll write on this. This is the simple interest formula from section 2.1 that just says I equals PRT. So interest equals principal times rate times time. And you can see it's already put the numbers in for us. But the length of time that we're talking about in these problems is just going to be 1 because it's just 1 month. So we don't even really need to write times 1 because times 1 is not changing anything, but that's what t is. So really principal times interest rate, there's the interest rate, the 1.3%, but notice the principal has the 250 already subtracted out from it. So it said that, May 1st, that the balance was $1,350, and then a payment was received on May 8th of $250. So that the payment subtracts from the $1,350. Okay, so take the initial balance, subtract any payments made, use that as your principal. And I like that the parentheses are here to kind of group this together as one number, and then you multiply it by the interest rate. So I'm just going to sort of highlight that this is P. Usually we use an uppercase P, but it looks like there's a lowercase p here. It's the same thing for us. So working this out on a calculator, you would find 1430. That's the amount of interest that's due. So the next problem wants us to find the total balance owed at the end of the billing period. And this right here, this is sort of a formula. Maybe I will circle this. This is how we want to think about credit card balances. The balance that you owe is the sort of unpaid balance that carried over from previously, plus the interest, which, by the way, that's what we just found, plus the charges for those 3 items that was sort of detailed in the problem. So you see the numbers are already given here. There's the I that we found, the 1430. The 1100, I'll just point out that the 1100 here, that came from 1350 minus 250. So it says unpaid balance, right? So the initial balance was 1350, and 250 of it was paid. So the remainder, the sort of the rest of the balance that has been unpaid so far is 1100, plus the interest we found up above, plus the charges that were done throughout the month, and you get this amount. And here it is as a sentence. That's the answer for that kind of problem. And we're going to do one of these on our own in a minute. I know this one's already typed for us. Let's look at what part 3 was asking. So if you flip back to it, it says this card requires a $10 minimum monthly payment if the total balance owed is less than $360. So yeah, that's sometimes how these things go, is that credit card payments, like the minimum amount due, there's usually some kind of threshold. So you're paying at least $10. It says otherwise the minimum monthly payment is 1/36 of the balance owed on the last day of the billing period, rounded to the nearest whole dollar. What is the minimum monthly payment due June 9th? So again, it's typed for us, but this exceeds $360. So we're not going with that $10 rule. We're going with 1/36 of this. So you just take the balance owed, which we already found, and we want 1/36 of it. So you divide by 36, do it on a calculator. And in the problem, it said rounded to the nearest whole dollar. And that's where this comes from. So you see, this credit card would require, at bare minimum, $10, right? But because the balance owed was, quite a bit larger, the minimum payment for that month was $45. All right, so next up, we'll do one of these on our own. So this next page has a similar problem with 3 parts. So look at how it's all broken down for us here. First of all, the interest rate is given in the problem. It does say monthly, so we're working with 1 month in these credit card problems. October 1st, October 31st. Okay, so initial balance, right, on the beginning of the month is quite high. And then we have payment received. That's a big sized payment. And then, there are some purchases throughout the month. Just 2 of them we'll have to take into account. Okay, so in number 1, we're doing kind of what the other problem had, which is I equals PRT. All right, so the formula for this section is basically that, plus the thing we'll do in part 2. And for the principal, it's kind of like the other problem, where you take the initial balance and you subtract out any payments that were made. Probably one payment was made in the month. That's my P. And then times the interest rate. Remember to convert it to a decimal. And in these credit card problems, we're talking about 1 month. So it said it was a monthly interest rate. So monthly interest rate times 1 month. So I worked this out on a calculator and rounded to the nearest cent. I got 59.52. That's just the interest. And you could see how if that much interest is happening every month, that could really add up. But anyway, part 2 wants us to find total balance owed. So I'll write what was sort of a formula. I mean, it's a formula in words. But it's that the balance owed equals the unpaid balance plus the interest plus the new charges. Right? That's what the previous problem used, and that's what we need to use here. So in this problem, the unpaid balance, remember, it's not 4720. It's 4720 with the 1,000 taken out. So 3720 is the unpaid balance. Then the interest that we already found. And then the new charges, which in this problem, it looks like there were 2 of them, the 1,025 and the 45. Yeah, so I guess the important formulas to know are the I equals PRT and this balance owed formula. So with a calculator, I got 4,849.52. Next up, part 3 is similar to that other part 3, where there's a minimum monthly payment if the total balance owed is small, and then otherwise, in most cases, you do this 1/36 rule for this problem. So we look at the balance owed. Wow, the balance owed is kind of large, so it's going to definitely be over 360. So we just take the 4849.52. And you could either divide by 36 or multiply by 1/36. That's the same thing, right? If I took this number and divided by 36, or if I did it this way, you get the same thing. Let's see, does it say anything about rounding? I guess in the previous problem, it said to round it to the nearest dollar. This one doesn't say anything like that. So if a problem doesn't say, then let's go with dollars and cents, but round it to the nearest cent. We're not going to pay half of a cent. That's what I got. All right, so I think we're ready for the next page. And yeah, it looks like the next page has a similar problem. So here's what I'm going to say. I know we're doing this on a video, but if we were doing this in class, I would ask you to try this one. So I'm going to suggest that you try this entire page, problem 42, and maybe pause the video, try the problem, and then you can check with me. All right, so I gave you a chance to pause the video and maybe try this, but you see it's similar to the previous one. Everything is sort of outlined here. We have initial balance, interest rate is given up in the problem. Notice that in these credit card problems, the interest rate seems relatively small compared to some of the interest rates that we've seen in this chapter. But the thing is, the interest rate might seem small, but it's a monthly interest rate. And throughout most of the chapter, we usually had an annual interest rate. So this might look smaller, but it can really add up over the course of a year. Anyway, Here's how I did this one. So we're using that I equals PRT. In this one, it's 1535 minus 125 times the interest rate that you have to remember to carefully convert it to a decimal. 1.25%, looks like that. And on a calculator, I got this as 1763. Next up, find the total balance owed. And by the way, I know all three of these problems so far have been set up the same way with these three parts to it. Keep in mind, it might not always be broken up into the same three parts. So I guess what I want to say is, what if we had a problem that just asked us part two? Like if it didn't ask part one, didn't ask part three, just said, here's all this information, find the total balance owed. Well, you would have to find the interest anyway, wouldn't you? So even if it didn't ask for part one, you would have to do it anyway in order to answer part two. Just keep that in mind. I feel like when it's broken up into these three parts, it's kind of guiding us through the problem. Like we use part one to answer part two, we use part two to answer part three, but if a problem just asks for one thing, then it might be up to you to figure out what do you need to do. Okay. Unpaid balance. The 1535 minus the 125 is 1410. Plus the interest we found, plus the new charges. And I guess on the new charges, when you write them out, maybe just double check that you got all of them. Yeah, there were this one, and this one. And, just be careful about those. Make sure you don't miss one. All right, 1875.63 is what I got. Rounded to the nearest cent. All right, I can tell this one is similar to the other problems. Instead of 1 over 36, this has a 1 over 24. So that can vary from one problem to another. So if the balance owed is less than 350, it's not. It's definitely over 350. Okay, so we just have to divide by 24. So either put this over 24 or multiply by 1 over 24. Either way, same thing. And then I just check, do we need this? Yeah, we need this rounded to the nearest whole dollar. So I'll tell you that on a calculator I got 78.15, but then I said, oh, well, we have to round to the nearest whole dollar, so let's make it 78. So my final answer, I'll make 78. And let's put a dollar sign in the final answer. It doesn't really matter if you have it in the sort of in-between steps. All right, so what have we got next? I mean, if you look at the next page, we're kind of done with these problems. So let's talk briefly about the next couple of pages. We are sort of getting close to the end of the chapter, so the next couple of pages review some of the things you need. Again, I'm not going to read every word to you. I might actually just give you a quick overview. Skills checklist for the chapter. And it has some general advice. I think you should read through this. It's a good thing to do. I want to just add a couple of little notes to it. So calculation reminders. Number one, always list all the values for the variables in the equation before solving it. So the values for the variables means things like P, R, N, T, etc. A might be another one of them. It just depends on the problem. But I do think it's a good idea to write those out before you get too deep into the problem. Organize all the information that's given. And sometimes if one of them is not given, I might say that it equals question mark, to sort of remind myself that that's the one I'm trying to find. Always list the steps. Oh, this is something we should talk about. Always list the steps of each calculation to help you find errors. Don't just plug everything into the calculator. So my opinion on this is, sometimes you see me do this. Sometimes you see me show every little step, do the thing in parentheses first, find that, then do the thing in the exponent, then do whatever else. But sometimes you've seen me just kind of do it all at once. Personally, I think it depends on your calculator, and it depends on how comfortable you are with your calculator. I've been using this one, and this one does fractions really well. But I always say that you have to be careful about the sort of nuances of your calculator and how your calculator does fractions and parentheses. So to some extent, it's up to you. But I do think that listing the steps and showing as much work as possible is a good idea because it helps you get partial credit if something goes wrong. Also, listing the values, that's kind of a little step that you can show. Basically, we'd like you to show work because it shows, justifies why the answer is what it is. But also, if you get the wrong answer, I'm going to go back and look at the work that you did to try to give you partial credit. But if you wrote nothing, then there's nothing I can really do. So, good idea to list steps. As you're doing in between steps in a problem, like along the way, don't round things off too early. Maybe round off your final answer, but don't round things off in the middle because that can mess things up. Anyway, I also want to highlight number 3. I'll just put a star next to it. Always ask yourself, does my answer make sense? Maybe in this section, I didn't really point that out too much, but in some of the previous sections, I did. Interest, you know how interest works by now. So an amount should be growing or an amount should be shrinking, and you can look at the answer and ask if it makes sense. What else? All right, this just has some formulas. I like this thing at the bottom of the page kind of mentioning these are values of n, right? So when you're doing compound interest and a problem says monthly, to use n equals 12. If it says quarterly, use n equals 4, and so on. I just want to add something here is one of the other ones that was mentioned earlier in the chapter was semi-annually. It doesn't come up that often, but I have seen it in some problems, and that means 2 times per year. So just in case you see that, this is usually going to be the value of n that you have to use. Let's look at the next page. Let's see. I don't know if I had anything to add to this page. I think, it's just kind of reminding you of some of the formulas. And, formula for finding A, formula for finding P. So you can read that on your own. Annuities. Remember, annuities are where you make periodic deposits. That might be a deposit every month or a deposit every year. It just depends on the problem. Here are the big formulas that we had. So I don't really have anything to add to this page. Next page, there's this word. I just want to point out that we might not have said this much, but this just means paying off an amount over time. That's all it means. So we're talking about things like car loans, mortgage loans, could be a student loan. And then this kind of goes over, there's that monthly payment formula that we had. Remember the thing about points, that's for mortgages. So if a mortgage has 1 point, then you kind of have a 1% amount and so on. And then in the end, since this is just a quick review, it just says credit cards, the unpaid balance method. So it doesn't have any big crazy formulas, just kind of the small formulas that we used. All right, so as we're wrapping things up, you see this section didn't really have a lot for us to do. There weren't that many problems, but we're getting to the end of the chapter. We're thinking about reviewing the whole chapter and studying. So I do want to just point out a couple of things. That's the end of 2.6. Notice that 2.7 is a short section for identifying which formulas to use. And I'm not going to cover it right here, right now. I think this is really something that you should try on your own. I want to remind you that there is a formula sheet that we provide. I'll just show it real quick. I mean, it's kind of zoomed in so you can't see the whole thing, but, you know, looks like I grabbed this from page 77 in the book, but I think it's also in the back of the workbook. Yeah, this formula page with some playing cards on the bottom. We're going to get to that later in the semester. But the idea is, even if all of these formulas are given, you still need to figure out which one to use for a problem. And you should try section 2.7 for practice. You know, you could have the formula in front of you. And all this section really wants you to do, it doesn't give you much space. It just wants you to figure out the formula, like how you would start the problem, and you don't have to do the whole problem. Now, the section after that, 2.8, now 2.8 is problems that you should do the entire problem, and you can also try those for practice. What I think I want to do now, just for the last couple of minutes here, is I want us to look at one of the problems in 2.8, the end of the chapter exercises. So I'm going to go here to this credit card problem, number 10. Since we've been talking about the credit card section, take a moment, read this over. I think what I'm going to suggest is get to this problem in the chapter exercises about credit cards and, you know, maybe pause the video and try it, and then I'll go over it. All right, so this will be our last thing for now, is let's talk about this problem. So we get to see another credit card problem, because that section was pretty short. So we have our interest rate. That's going to be our lowercase r. Let's say r equals 0.0195. It looks like we have a 1 month period. The unpaid balance starting out was $26.75. Payment was received. We know what to do with that. There are no purchases. Look at that, no purchases. So no new charges that we have to worry about. Payment due date, October 10th. Find the interest rate. Oh, I'm sorry. Find the interest due. Let me underline that. Find the interest due, not the interest rate. Using the unpaid balance method. That's the only method we've talked about. Also, look at that. There's a second thing. Okay, so this one is not broken into two parts, but it is asking us for both parts anyway. So let's go straight into the interest. We should use I equals PRT. And remember, for the principal, you take the $26.75 and you subtract the $350. So we're subtracting out the payment that was made. Should look like this. And you can use a calculator for this. So I get 45.34 is the interest due. On a problem like this, you know, we were careful when we were reading the problem. I underlined both things that we need to find. So make sure that you found both of them. Don't just stop here, right? Because if you stop here, you kind of did half of the problem. And we need to do the other part. Before I go on, though, I want to say something quick about calculator. When I wrote it on my page, I have parentheses here, right? So let me just show you this. Maybe you can see this on your screen. If I do 26.75 minus 350, you see that I have parentheses. And then I do times 0. I think when I keep typing, it's going to scroll off of the screen. But you can see I have, this is all grouped in parentheses. 0.195 times 1. I'll do the times 1, and I'll hit my equals or enter. All right, so I got this, and you can see that I rounded off to the nearest cent, which was 45.34. The thing that I want to point out is that those parentheses are important. So I usually don't like to show you the wrong thing, but I do want to show you what would happen if I didn't use the parentheses. If I typed the exact same thing without parentheses. All right, how about this? How about this? I don't think I really need to type the times 1. The times 1 doesn't change anything. So if I type the times 1, it's just going to scroll this off the screen. But you see, if I type the same thing without parentheses, it's going to give me a different answer. Because in math, there's like order of operations where things in parentheses happen first, and then multiplication, and then addition, subtraction. So the problem is, if I hit enter here, my calculator thinks I only want to multiply the 350 times the decimal. And that's not really what we want. On our page, we wrote it well. We want this entire amount to get multiplied by the decimal. So this is going to give me a wrong answer. Now, I guess the moral of the story is that the parentheses are important, but there's kind of another side to this, which is we said that you should always check your answer to ask yourself if it makes sense. And I think if you look at the amount, the amount that was owed and a payment was made, I don't think the interest should be this much money for 1 month, right? So if you got an answer like this, 2,600 something, I think that you would see it and say, wait a second, that can't be right. I must have done something wrong. And then you kind of go back and check it again and be careful. So something to watch out for. All right, but let's wrap up this problem. So next is the balance owed equals the unpaid balance plus the interest plus the new charges. Can I also point something else out? Where is it here? I want to point out that this line that I just wrote, I'll put a star next to it. I want to point out that that is not on the formula sheet. That's nowhere to be found on this formula sheet. So I guess that is a formula that you need to know. That simple interest formula is here, I equals PRT, so that's good. But this you just need to know yourself. But if you think about it, it makes sense. The amount that you owe is what you owed previously, plus the interest that accrued, plus anything new that you spent. So those 3 things. All right, I worked this out to be, all right, well, there's the 2675 minus the 350, plus the 4534, plus, there were no new charges. This problem specifically told us there were no new charges, so that actually made that one easier. And then I found this to be 2370.34. It doesn't say anything about rounding to $1, so I'm just going to round to the nearest cent. That's the balance. All right, so that's really it for this discussion of the credit card section. I think that this credit card section is, in my opinion, it's kind of easier than some of the other stuff we were talking about. The formulas are simpler. You still have to be careful about it. But yeah, that's it. So, take a look at the 2.6 problems, the 2.7 problems, and we just did one problem from 2.8. So you've got plenty of stuff to work on. And as always, feel free to ask me if you have any questions.